We launch our own podcast. You can listen to it through Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. We'll be covering stories from around the world, similar to those you see on this program, but we'll get a bit more personal and candid with our guests and correspondents. So if you're on the go, whether on the train, driving to work, or just out for a run, give us a listen and make sure to subscribe. Search online for CGTN and the Heat podcast. The United States calls off tariffs after Mexico agrees to do more to address the migration crisis. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. US President Donald Trump announces he's indefinitely suspending tariffs against Mexico after reaching an immigration deal. On Friday, Mexico pledged to deploy more National Guard troops along the border with Guatemala in an effort to slow the large number of Central Americans reaching the United States. Mexico also agreed to expand a program that allows the United States to return migrants to Mexico while they wait for American asylum hearings to take place. In May, the US Border Patrol apprehended more than 132,000 migrants, the highest monthly total since 2007. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo praised the deal reached between the United States and Mexico.
The placement of 6,000 Mexican National Guard along the Mexican southern border is the biggest effort to date that the Mexicans made, and something that we pressed for with them throughout the time of the negotiations. We'll work closely with them to make sure that that is a successful effort. Those crossing the U.S. southern border to seek asylum will be rapidly returned to Mexico, where they may await their adjudication of their asylum claims.
For more now on the US-Mexico deal, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Portland, Oregon is Laura Carlsen. She's the director of the Americas program with the Center for International Policy. Also with us is Andalusia Knoll. She's a multimedia journalist based in Mexico City. From New York, Amy Holmes is a political commentator and columnist for the Swiss weekly Der Weltwoche. And Rafael Bernal is a staff writer for the United States political newspaper, The Hill, right here in Washington, D.C. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Laura Carlsen, let me start with you. There was a bit of a quick turnaround there by President Trump. He announced these tariffs, and then almost a week later, he says, well, no more tariffs, and Mexico, according to President Trump, has agreed to deploy more troops and to take back Central American migrants awaiting asylum hearings. What do you make of this?
Well, it was a terrible idea in the first place to ever announce those tariffs, to try to use economic measures as economic blackmail against Mexico to support what's fundamentally an anti-immigrant white nationalist agenda of the Trump administration. And what Donald Trump did not calculate is the blowback from his own party, the Republicans in Congress, as well as from the business community. We had the National Association of Manufacturers and prominent Republican leaders saying that they could not go along with these tariffs. And the trade associations were already lobbying in Washington, trying to prevent the tariffs that could have wreaked havoc on one of the most important trade relationships that the United States has. So in the end, of course, he suspended the tariffs just days before they were to begin to go into effect at 5% and announced this deal with Mexico. While it's true that this deal with Mexico with the 6,000 National Guard is really an extension, it's not something really new, it's an extension of what existed before, I think it's very important not to feed into this as an electoral issue. Right now, what's happening is the media comes out and saying, well, Donald Trump really didn't accomplish anything with these tariffs as a way of criticizing Trump, and that's causing Trump to come back with inventing a supposed secret agreement that's even stricter with Mexico and trying to justify the tariffs. What we can do at this point is say that this is the agreement, and it's not new, but it's a slight extension.
All right, let's bring in Andalusia Knoll. She's in Mexico City. And Andalusia, President Trump says that this deal is, quote, fully signed and documented. Although, as Laura Carlsen just pointed out a moment ago, there are reports that the measures that Mexico will be taking was agreed to, actually, a long time ago. What are you hearing in Mexico City about what's transpired over the last week?
Sure. I think in general, people are feeling somewhat defeated that the United States says jump and Mexico says how high. And there's actually was a joke circulating today of López Obrador, the president, saying that my foreign secretary went to D.C. and all he brought me back was this shirt, and it was a Border Patrol uniform. So I think people are feeling that really Mexico has just caved into everything that Trump wants regarding migration. But as Laura already mentioned, Mexico, this is not something new. Mexico, for at least the past 4 years, has been catering to the United States with a southern migration border plan where they have increased their detentions and deportations, not only of Central American migrants, but also of Cuban, African, and Haitian migrants, and migrants that come from all over the world. And so now this is just an extension of the migration policy that Mexico has already had. And actually in May, deportations of Central American migrants was over 15,000 migrants were deported in 1 month, which is up over 100% from the previous year. And this is before this whole agreement with the United States.
Amy Holmes, President Trump, of course, has been talking about this agreement, this deal that he's made with Mexico. He did not divulge any details of it when he was asked about it. This is what he had to say. Let's listen to this.
That's the agreement that everybody says they don't have. So, no, because I'm going to let Mexico do the announcement at the right time. From Mexico, they want to go through, but here's the agreement. It's a very simple agreement. This is one page. This is one page of a very long and very good agreement for both Mexico and the United States. Without the tariffs, we would have had nothing.
So, Amy, one page there he was waving around of a very long agreement, he says. Why is the president so reluctant to release details of this agreement?
Well, he also said that it needs to be ratified in Mexico by the broader Mexican legislature. But at this point, I think we're getting a lot of conflicting reports. So we just heard both that this has been in the works for a long time, but then that Mexico also caved, and that President Trump says jump and Mexico says how high, which would suggest that the tariff threat was lighting a fire under Mexican authorities. We also have a report from the Washington Post. The headline was how Mexico talked President Trump out of imposing these tariffs. And these reporters are saying that they've looked at documents from both the U.S. government and the Mexican government, and that this is an unprecedented crackdown on illegal immigration coming up from Central America, and that documents from the Mexican side, and this is all reported by the Washington Post, by the way, not from President Trump, that they've looked at Mexican official documents saying that this is the first time, it is unprecedented, that the Mexico government will be prioritizing border security at its southern border with Guatemala. I'll tell you, I just had dinner on Sunday with friends who came back from the border between Mexico and Guatemala, one of whom is a Mexican American and has a large family in Mexico City, and he said there was absolutely nobody there to patrol a wide open border, a wide open field between Mexico and Guatemala, and that he was actually really looking forward to that situation being rectified. But again, I think that there is a lot of conflicting reports because we haven't seen all the details. When we see all the details, we'll know a lot more.
Rafael, this is how the Mexican Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard explained this agreement with the United States. Let's watch this.
Today, the Americans decide to return to Mexico 8,000 people who are waiting for a hearing in the United States for asylum. And for these people, Mexico is offering support, and we are doing this and calling on the President of the Republic to do this. Because from Mexico, because of our convictions and feelings of solidarity, these people, while they are in Mexico, we will stand in solidarity with them. We are going to protect their rights.
So you report this story every day. What are you hearing about what happened?
So what he's saying there is consistent with what Mexico's been saying for the entirety of this administration since December 1st. The distinction is Mexico is allowing and not pushing back on the United States when the United States says that every Central American who applies for asylum in the United States will be sent back to Mexico to wait. And you can call that an expansion of what was happening a few months ago when Interior Secretary Olga Sanchez Cordero was in D.C. And said that the Americans had asked her for this and said that Mexico had said under no circumstances will we do this. Sure, expansion. And there was
This is the safe third country proposal.
So there's a difference between the migrant protection protocols or remain in Mexico and the safe third country agreement. The safe third country agreement, we're not quite there. That would be having Central Americans apply for asylum in Mexico. What's happening now is Central Americans are applying for asylum in the United States and awaiting their case, their adjudication of their case, while remaining in Mexico, hence the nickname. But a few months ago, there was severe pushback from the Mexicans. There was a pilot agreement to start with 2,000 to 8,000 people. And that was severely criticized. But the argument that we just heard Ebrard say, that Mexico was going to protect their human rights and wasn't going to immediately send them back to their countries of origin, although it had the right to, or deny the Americans the right to send them to Mexico. Right. That was one thing. But now when it's across the entire border, yeah, sure, you can call it an expansion, but just on those grounds, it's a massive expansion of the agreements that they had 3 months ago.
Laura, the United States is presenting this threat to impose tariffs on Mexico and the subsequent withdrawal of that threat as something of a victory. This is what the U.S. Acting Secretary for Homeland Security, Kevin McAleenan, had to say. Let's listen.
The president put a charge in this whole dialogue with Mexico, with the tariff threat, brought them to the table. The foreign minister from Mexico arrived within hours. He arrived the next day with real proposals on the table. This is the first time we've heard anything like this kind of number of law enforcement being deployed in Mexico to address migration, not just at their southern border, but also on the transportation routes to the northern border and in coordinated patrols in key areas along our southwest border.
So listening to that, Laura, the implication here is that this was something of a standoff. I mean, one's tempted to say a Mexican standoff, but it wasn't quite that. That Mexico blinked. Is that what happened?
No, that's a false portrayal of what this immigration issue has been and the dialogue that's been going on between the United States and Mexican governments for months. Basically since the beginning of the year. And even if you go further back to 2014 with the unaccompanied minors crisis, so-called crisis of that year. And what really happened is that there are two different models at stake here. Mexico is saying, in order to stop migration, we have to go to the roots. We have to have a development plan for Central America that will reduce violence and the reasons that people are fleeing their countries. And they're looking for a more human rights-based model. Supposedly, in action, they've had to apply these kinds of crackdowns because of pressure from the Trump administration and the dependency of the Mexican economy on the United States. In this case, it was a manufactured crisis that Donald Trump decided to respond with these tariffs because he already has an electoral strategy for 2020 that's hinging once again on Mexico bashing and cracking down on immigration in order to mobilize his core base for whom that's a core issue.
Andalusia, President Trump has made this threat. He's backtracked on it. And I'm wondering, how has this changed the relationship between these two countries? The Wall Street Journal reported just 2 days ago that President Trump's attacks against Mexico have changed the atmosphere from one of friendliness and cooperation to one of frosty coexistence. Is that a fair characterization?
I don't think that that's necessarily accurate because I think since President Trump has taken office and in his campaign, the relationship has been somewhat hostile between Mexico and the U.S. But I would agree that Mexico does adhere often to what the U.S. wants with the migration policy, that this is new, that they will send 6,000 troops to the border, but cracking down on migration is not new, and that Mexico has been doing this for years. And I do think, I mean, basically economically, the peso fell drastically last week, and now it is recovering, you know, because business is seeing that there's not, the threat of tariffs is at the moment on pause. But I do think, especially speaking among the Mexican population, I don't think there was really that much of a surprise this time about the tariffs because Mexicans are now so used to Trump speaking down on them and also criticizing them and just considering Mexico, you know, lesser country to the south of the United States. So I did not actually see all that much reaction from general, like average population to these tariffs. I think it was more in the business community was really where the concern was.
Amy, is this part of President Trump's re-election strategy?
Well, certainly he's been under a lot of pressure to deliver on his campaign promise in 2016 that he would be cracking down on illegal immigration coming through our southern border. But I think it's really important to make a distinction here. Legal immigration has actually gone up under President Trump slightly than under President Obama. It's a little bit about over 1 million a year. That's in legal immigration. Illegal immigration has skyrocketed, and even the New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, even Democrats now are saying that illegal immigration through our southern border is a crisis. You just quoted the number just this past May, 132,000 illegal border crossings that we know about, and that's an historic high. Now, there's some theories that Donald Trump's sort of chest beating is part of what's driving this illegal immigration, that people want to get across the border, before the tough rules come down, and it'll be much more difficult. But I think it's very important to make that distinction. Distinction number 2, asylum claims. Economic asylum is not a basis for being granted asylum in the United States. You have to prove being politically persecuted by your native country. Yeah. And for our viewers to know that the last year of President Obama's presidency, only 20,455 people were granted asylum in the United States from all over the world. That's all of the people that were granted asylum, roughly only 6,600 from Mexico and Central America. The asylum process is being abused. The New York Times has even reported that 80% of asylum seekers, they do not get asylum, but they've already disappeared into the country. So that process needs major reform to be able to close those loopholes and have an asylum process that makes sense.
Right. Laura, what is your view on that? Is the asylum process being abused here in the United States? Because we know that a lot of people are fleeing Central America because of poverty, but they're also fleeing because of extreme violence, gang violence, as well as very deep-seated corruption in those countries.
Yes, it's very important to make a correction. We're not talking about illegal immigration when we're talking about asylum seekers. Asylum seekers have the right to cross the border into a country that they consider safe, whether it's at a port of entry or not, and request asylum. Another reason why these figures are going up is because these families, and there's a huge increase in the percentage of families over single adult males, which was the pattern previously, are immediately delivering themselves to Border Patrol. This is the proper way to do this. This is the legal way, and they have international and national rights to do that. As far as the fact, and this is another important correction, that this huge percentage of people do not return for their asylum hearings and disappear into the United States, that's simply not true. The statistics are out there that the majority return to their asylum hearings, and it's also true that the majority are often rejected. But they have a right to due process, and that right to due process is being jeopardized by sending them back to Mexico because they have less of an opportunity to be with their attorneys and to prepare their cases. And we also know, because of the interviews, I was just in Tijuana talking to many of the asylum seekers, we also know that now, because of changes in what's happening, the crises in Central American countries, that indeed, whereas we had a previous pattern of economic reasons, it's now violence.
Rafael, go ahead.
That is a core point. One thing I've noticed when the government and immigrant rights activists are talking past each other, which happens a lot, they're not having a conversation. On this point of immigrant representation and asylum seeker representation, the government uses a figure that an overwhelming number of people who apply for asylum end up not getting it. The immigrant rights activists use a figure where they say an overwhelming number, and I'm talking 80s, 90s percentile overwhelming, of people with legal representation who apply for asylum do end up getting it. And now, of course, the number of people with legal representation is actually quite small. So those numbers don't contradict each other, right. But the fact that these people will be going through their process while in Mexico will, as Laura says, at least put them at a distance from their attorneys and minimize their possibilities for representation.
Just let me clarify something. Up until these new rules came into being, anybody who applied for asylum was allowed to stay in the United States while awaiting the outcome of that application.
Almost. You have to pass what's known as a credible fear test, where you basically ask tell a border agent that you have a fear based on a certain subset of ideas, and it's true, economic fear is not one of them.
Yeah.
But if you're persecuted as a group, and it could be state violence in Central America, it could be the idea of criminal violence and family violence is under debate, but so far has been mostly accepted as passing of this credible fear examination.
But I think it's very important to talk about the asylum process separately from legal versus illegal immigration, and also to note that even under EU law, as adjudicated by the EU Supreme Court, there's this idea that you should be seeking asylum in the first safe country in which you arrive. And for Central Americans, that would be Mexico, but instead they've been coming up through Mexico to our southern border to seek asylum in the United States, which would indicate that what many are seeking really is economic refuge, which is not the proper place to be trying to gain legal entry into the United States. So what that ends up doing is creating a huge backlog of asylum cases, most of which will be turned down, and then asylum seekers who do have a credible reason to be here and would gain asylum, their case is pushed back many years as well. So this system, it's not working for the United States, and I don't think it's working for genuine asylum seekers.
I think that again is a matter of debate. The case for Mexico as a safe third country can be made in a very minimal number of cases for Central Americans. And particularly, well, first of all, is Mexico a safe country? Well, parts of Mexico are, parts of Mexico aren't. It's a very large country. So that part of the debate is one thing, but then for a safe third country to be able to be that.
But has Amy got a point when she says the legal definition of that is you seek refuge in the first safe country that you arrive in?
Well, yes and no. It's actually another murky legal point.
Right.
But for instance, the United States has one safe third country agreement. It's with Canada, and it is the first safe third country. How do you define the safe third country? First of all, by the country's safety, and again, that's where Mexico is murky. And the second of all, by the country's ability to take you in as a refugee. Mexico's refugee office has a budget of about $1 million per year. They can probably handle, I don't know, 40 refugees in a practical manner. That's an exaggeration, of course, but certainly not the numbers coming from Central America.
Okay, Andalusia, go ahead.
Right, yes. Yes, I think it's important to point out both as far as handling refugees. I just spoke to a colleague who's on the southern border, and she said that also people that are applying for asylum, there are indigenous people from Guatemala who do not speak Spanish. There are people from Haiti, from Africa, and they're applying for asylum in Mexico, and there is no assistance of interpretation, and they don't speak Spanish. So that is also a violation of their human rights. But also, Tijuana is one of the most dangerous cities in the entire world. Last year, I spent months in Tijuana covering the arrival of the caravans last year, and there were 3 teenagers that were murdered in Tijuana while they were at a shelter, and they had been lured on the streets outside of the shelter, and they were brutally murdered. And Tijuana is not a safe place for people to wait for asylum. And also, I think I focused specifically on women fleeing domestic violence in Central America, largely in Honduras and El Salvador, where they're not just fleeing domestic violence from their partners, but also state violence, where the authorities did not respond to the violence that they face. And I think when asylum claims, you need lots of documentation. When someone fears that the next day someone is going to kill them, they do not have the time to get all their paperwork together and then travel 4,000 miles to get to the United States and then present a well-documented case for asylum.
Right,
so it's also important to point out that that is the reason many people are being rejected for asylum, because they don't have a way to document it. I did speak with some women who did bring photos on their cell phones of documents of how they had gone to local authorities. Local authorities had done nothing. They had photos of being beaten, of their injuries, but that was a very minimum amount of cases. Most women and most people fleeing violence don't have documentation of it, so it's very hard for them to get asylum.
Well, the problem here, however, is that under U.S. asylum law, being a victim of domestic violence is not grounds for being given or granted asylum. Now, that could change. That could be something that our Congress debates, whether or not they want to open up the asylum process to people in that category.
Yeah.
If that were the case, then that would be victims of domestic violence from all over the world. And we can sit here and name at least a dozen countries where that would be the case, and we would be granting asylum to half of their population. So I think we need to be a bit more specific about what we're talking about. Does this mean that we take victims of domestic violence from the entire Middle East where they implement Sharia law? Perhaps, but that's something that should be under debate by U.S. citizens.
All right, let me go to Laura. Laura, go ahead.
Well, I was saying that's actually not true. It was a reason for asylum. Jeff Sessions, as Attorney General, suspended it, and then it was challenged in the courts. So it continues to be accepted at this time, although, as was mentioned, it's under debate. I wanted to add that our organization just finished a lengthy legal study of the Safe Third Country Agreement in Europe, and it's a disaster. It's been challenged in the courts and suspended in some countries. There's a tremendous amount of confusion, and under international law, it's being challenged because what international law says is that an asylum seeker who's fleeing persecution, and it's not just, it's state violence, there's a number of different reasons for it, has the right to request asylum in a country where they feel safe. When I was in Tijuana a couple of weeks ago, I talked to several people who told stories about being attacked in Tijuana, about not feeling safe in Tijuana. There are people who said this to U.S. authorities in the United States, and they were thrown into what's called the hielera, the icebox, and basically punished for asking not to go back to Mexico. So there's this real aggressive policy against the international rights of people fleeing persecution. Right.
Rafael, I want to get back to the agreement, the deal. President Trump also said, he said this on Twitter, that Mexico has agreed to buy large quantities of U.S. agricultural products. A story in the Wall Street Journal says there's no reference to that in the joint declaration.
There's no indication that that was even discussed. The truth is Mexico does buy a lot of agricultural products, and that's part of why President Trump received a lot of pressure from people like Chuck Grassley. And everything indicates that Mexico will continue to buy these products, and if that's what he meant, that is likely accurate.
Amy, one other question, talking about the third country approach. The United States wants Mexico now to bear the main responsibility, to bear the brunt of the number of people seeking asylum in that part of the world. I mean, is that fair? Shouldn't the United States bear some responsibility? Because it's well documented that actions that the United States has taken in Central America has resulted in the fact that so many people are seeking asylum.
Well, again, I think we need to go back to what is the definition of asylum and what are the cases that that grant asylum. And again, as I point out to you, during the Obama administration, basically only between 20 and 21,000 people per year from around the world. We're talking from China, Pakistan, Mexico, Central America, Middle East, you name it, were granted asylum in the United States based on what are our asylum rules.
Right.
If you want to expand the definition and expand it to whether it's economic distress or because a government has a poor policing policy and so forth, that should be up for debate. But so far, our asylum system is fairly narrow and is not designed to be able to repatriate basically 3 countries in the Northern Triangle into the United States. That's just not what it's for.
All right, and we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.